My sister-in-law slapped me at my own anniversary dinner for serving myself before her. You forget your place in this family, she snapped while my husband just looked away. I set down my fork and slapped her back. Then I stood up. I wiped my hand on the napkin I'd ironed that morning, the way I ironed those napkins every single anniversary, because his mother had once told me that a woman who cared about her marriage cared about the details, and I had believed her for 11 years the way you believe things you're too tired to question. 11 years is a long time to learn a family's rules without anyone ever writing them down. At his mother's house, dinner started when she sat, and no one touched a fork before that, though the rule only ever seemed to matter when I was the one reaching. His sister's opinions arrived at full volume, and mine were expected to arrive as questions, phrased gently, preferably followed by an apology for asking. When his mother wanted a form signed or a paper reviewed, she liked to do it at the kitchen table with coffee in front of her, chatting about something else the whole time, so that whatever you were signing felt like a small, forgettable thing, sandwiched between stories about her garden. I used to think that was just how she was. Warm, if a little much. I filed it away the way you file away small oddities about the family you married into, because none of them, on their own, was worth a fight. My husband was not a cruel man. He was the kind of man who avoided conflict so thoroughly he mistook the avoidance itself for peacekeeping. When his sister compared my cooking unfavorably to a caterer at Easter, he laughed along instead of saying anything, and later told me she didn't mean anything by it. When his mother corrected the way I loaded her dishwasher, standing over me at her own sink at Christmas, he said that's just how his mother was in her own kitchen, and I should let her have it. I let her have it. I let his sister have it too. I let his family have every small thing they wanted from me, year after year, because the alternative seemed to be a fight I would have to have alone, without him, and I didn't think I could win it that way. There were moments that should have told me more than they did. 2 years before that dinner, his mother had visited us for a week while she recovered from a minor surgery, and I remember coming home from a client meeting to find her sitting at our dining table with a stack of my paperwork in front of her. Mortgage documents mostly, the kind of thing I kept in a drawer in my office. She told me she'd been looking for a pen and found the folder by accident, and that she hoped I didn't mind. She'd always found paperwork soothing, something about her generation and the habit of organizing things. I remember feeling a small, wordless discomfort at the sight of her handling documents with my name on them, and I remember dismissing it within the hour, because she was recovering from surgery and bored, and boredom makes people nosy in harmless ways. I think about that afternoon more than I'd like to admit now. Our anniversary dinners were always at his parents' house, a tradition his mother had established in our second year of marriage and never let go of since, on the grounds that family should celebrate family, and what was more family than the people who'd raised him. I stopped fighting that particular tradition around year 4. It was easier to host the celebration of my own marriage in someone else's dining room than to explain every single year why I wanted it somewhere else. That 11th anniversary, his mother had outdone herself. There was a roast, for good china, candles she'd been saving, she said, for the right occasion. His sister arrived late, as she often did, trailing the particular energy of someone who considered her own presence to be the actual occasion. My daughter, 7 that year, sat next to me in her good dress, quiet in the careful way children get quiet when they've learned to read a room before they can read a book. My son, 5, was more interested in the candles than the roast. Dinner went the way it always went. His mother served plates in an order that had nothing to do with proximity, and everything to do with some private hierarchy she'd never explained, and I'd never been positioned high enough on to question. His sister talked about her catering business, which had been struggling for years in a way that somehow never seemed to touch the quality of her clothes or the newness of her car, subjects that came up at every family gathering with a specificity that, looking back, I should have found strange. Toward the end of the meal, with the roast mostly gone and the serving dish sitting between us, I reached over and filled my own plate for seconds before my sister-in-law had filled hers. It should have meant nothing. It was a piece of roast and a spoonful of potatoes on a Tuesday in November, in the house where I had spent 11 consecutive anniversaries being quietly reminded of my rank. Her hand connected with my face before I'd even set the serving spoon down. "You forget your place in this family," she snapped, the words landing somewhere between a scold and a threat, delivered with the flat confidence of someone who had never once been made to answer for anything in that house. I looked at my husband. He looked at his plate. I set down my fork and slapped her back. Then I stood up. My palm still stung from where it had connected with her cheek, and I looked around the table at every single person who had just watched a grown woman strike me across the face and said nothing. "I'm done," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I'm done being quiet in my own marriage." Nobody said a word. My husband stared at his plate like it might offer him a way out of the room. His sister held her own cheek, glaring at me with genuine outrage, as if I had committed the violation and she was simply defending herself against it. His mother's mouth was a thin line. Nobody reached for me. Nobody asked if I was all right. My daughter had gone very still beside me, her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes moving between the adults at the table with the particular alertness of a child trying to determine whether the ground beneath her was actually solid. My son had stopped talking about the candles. "Get your coats," I told them, quiet enough that it took a second for them to register it as an instruction rather than another part of the strange scene they'd just watched unfold. We were in the car within 10 minutes. Nobody at that table tried to stop us. Nobody followed us to the driveway. I remember that more clearly than almost anything else from that night. The silence of the front door closing behind us, the porch light his mother always left on for guests still burning steadily as I backed out, as though the evening had been entirely ordinary. My daughter asked from the back seat why Aunt hit me. I told her that some grown-ups don't know how to say sorry, sorry, so instead they get angry, and that none of it was her fault and none of it was going to happen again. She was quiet after that, watching the streetlights slide past the window, and I could see in the mirror that she wasn't quite convinced, that some part of her 7-year-old mind had already filed the evening under things that don't add up, the way children do when the adults around them fail to explain something honestly. My son fell asleep somewhere on the highway, the way 5-year-olds can fall asleep through almost anything, his head tipped against the window, unbothered. I didn't call my mother before we arrived. Maybe some part of me needed the drive to be silent, but a neighbor of hers had apparently seen my car leaving the house at speed and mentioned it in a text, because when I pulled into her driveway, the porch light was already on and she was already standing in the doorway. She didn't ask a single question. She looked at the mark still darkening along my cheekbone, looked at my daughter's face and my son asleep against my shoulder, and pulled all 3 of us inside without a word. That first night in my childhood bedroom, with my daughter curled against the wall and my son asleep on a cot my mother had dragged up from the basement, I lay awake replaying the dinner, not the slap itself, the silence after it. 11 years of watching my husband go quiet whenever his family found some small way to remind me I hadn't been born into their particular version of belonging. And 11 years of telling myself that peace, even a manufactured and lopsided peace, was worth almost any price. I did the math on the price that night, lying in the dark, and it came out higher than I'd ever let myself calculate before. My phone lit up twice before midnight. My husband, the first time, asking if we were safe, if the kids were safe, a question that felt less like concern and more like an attempt to locate the exact shape of the disaster he now had to manage. I didn't answer. The second text was from his mother, 3 lines long, expressing how sorry everyone was that the evening had gotten so out of hand, and how she hoped I understood that his sister had been under a great deal of stress lately with the business, and how family disagreements were always easier resolved in person than over text. I read it twice. There was no apology in it that I could find, not really, just a careful redistribution of blame onto stress and misunderstanding, phrased in the warm, reasonable voice she used for everything, including, I now suspected, things that weren't warm or reasonable at all. I didn't respond to that one either. My mother came in around midnight with a cup of tea I didn't ask for, and sat on the edge of the bed while I pretended I might actually drink it. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't tell me it would be all right, or that families were complicated, or any of the soft, deflecting things people say when they don't know what else to offer. She just sat there, in the dark, the way she used to sit with me when I was small and couldn't sleep, until eventually I did. The following morning, my daughter asked if we were going back. I told her I didn't know yet. She nodded, the way she'd nodded the night before, like she was filing the answer away next to all the other things that didn't quite add up, and went to find her brother, who was already in my mother's kitchen asking, with total 5-year-old sincerity, whether there was any of the good cereal. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time that morning, turning my phone over in my hands, not answering it, watching the sun come up through a window I'd watched 1,000 sunrises through as a child, in a house where nobody had ever once needed a hierarchy to decide who got served first. He called for 3 days straight. I let it ring out the first 2, watching the screen light up and go dark, over and over, a small silent argument I refused to have with him at a distance. On the 3rd day, mostly out of exhaustion, I answered. My sister will apologize, he said, before I'd even gotten out a hello, as though he'd been rehearsing the line for 3 days and needed to get it out before his nerve went. The kids need us together. This has gotten way out of hand. How many times did you watch her humiliate me and say nothing? I asked. I wasn't shouting. I didn't have the energy left for shouting. Not just this one. All of them. Every dinner, every holiday, every single time your mother corrected me in her own kitchen like I was staff. How many times? He didn't answer. The silence that followed was the same silence he'd offered across a decade of dinner tables, and for the first time, I heard it clearly for what it was. Not neutrality, not peacekeeping, just a choice he kept making over and over that happened to be easier for him than standing up for me. I need some time, I told him, and hung up before he could turn the sentence into a negotiation. I filed the following week. I found my attorney through a friend from my design work who'd gone through her own divorce and still spoke about her lawyer with a kind of grateful reverence. Her name was Mara, and she worked out of a small office above a bakery, the smell of bread drifting up through the floorboards while I sat across from a woman built entirely out of competence. She had a way of asking questions that made you realize you'd never actually examined your own life very closely. How were finances handled? Who paid for what? Had I ever signed anything I didn't fully understand? I answered honestly and mostly, I thought, unremarkably. Ours had been an ordinary marriage in most of the ways that mattered. A joint account, a mortgage we split according to who earned what that year. I'll pull 4 years of statements, Mara said, making a note. It's routine. Most of the time, it just confirms what everyone already knows. I appreciated, even then, how she made the process sound almost administrative, when everything about my life at that point felt like it was on fire. The custody conversation, in those early weeks, moved more smoothly than I'd braced for. My calendar told most of the story on its own. 4 years of school pickups, pediatrician visits, parent-teacher conferences, all logged under my name. Mara said the courts liked patterns like that. My husband's attorney agreed to a temporary arrangement that kept the kids primarily with me, with structured time for him on weekends. My daughter asked during that first weekend visit whether she had to go, and I told her yes, that her father loved her even if he hadn't been very good lately at loving me the right way. She went. She came back quieter than she'd left. His mother texted twice more during that stretch, expressing hope that things could be resolved amicably. I noticed she never used the word slap. I noticed, too, she never asked how I was, only how quickly this this could be over. I didn't respond to either message. 4 weeks in, Mara called to schedule a check-in. Nothing urgent, she said. Just wanted to walk me through the account statements before we moved into the settlement phase. I remember driving to that meeting without any particular dread. I had no idea, sitting in her waiting room with that same bakery smell rising through the floor, that the numbers weren't going to match anything I remembered at all. Mara had a folder waiting on the desk when I sat down, and something in the set of her shoulders told me before she said a word that this wasn't going to be the confirming what you already know conversation I'd driven over expecting. I want to walk you through this carefully, she said, because I don't think you're going to recognize most of it. She slid the folder across. 4 years of statements from our joint account, individual transactions highlighted in a soft yellow that, looking at the pattern of them laid out together for the first time, made my stomach drop in a way that no single one of them ever could have on its own. Amounts that were never large enough, on their own, to trip any alarm. 200 here, 400 there. A larger transfer around the holidays, explained away, if I'd ever noticed it at all, as a shared gift or a family expense. Add it up, Mara said, and it comes to almost $60,000, moved out of your joint account over 4 years into an account belonging to your sister-in-law's catering business. I stared at the folder for a long moment before I could make myself speak. That business has been struggling since before we got married, I said, because it was the only thing I could think to say. The fact I'd always been told, over and over at every holiday, as though repetition made it true. It's been struggling the way a business struggles when someone keeps quietly covering its losses, Mara said. The transfers are labeled as loans in your husband's handwriting on a set of notes I found attached to the account records. Not one payment ever came back the other direction. I thought about the new oven that had appeared at the catering kitchen the same month my husband had asked me, gently, almost apologetically, to trim our grocery budget for a few weeks while things were tight. I thought about the birthday gifts his sister gave the kids that never seemed to match the financial picture she described at every family dinner. The designer things, the vacations, the new car every few years that apparently belonged to a business perpetually one bad month from collapse. I realized, sitting there, I had noticed a dozen small mismatches over the years and let every single one of them go, because questioning them felt like questioning the whole fragile architecture of a marriage I'd worked very hard to keep standing. He's going to say they were loans, I said. He can say whatever he wants, Mara said. The court cares about documentation, and right now the only documentation that exists says money left your account and never came back. That's a strong position for us, even before he offers an explanation. I sat in her office for a long time after that, turning the folder over in my hands, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage exactly, though rage was somewhere underneath it. Mostly just tired. The specific exhaustion of finally having a number attached to something I'd carried in my body for years without ever being able to name it properly. $60,000. 11 years of small humiliations at that family's table suddenly had a receipt, an itemized, dated, undeniable receipt, and somehow that made the whole thing worse rather than better, because it meant I hadn't been imagining the shape of what was happening to me. It had a shape. It had a total. I called my mother from the parking lot below Mara's office and told her everything, and she was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment before she said the kind of thing only a mother can say and have it land the way it needs to. You always knew something was off with that money, she said. You just didn't have the paper yet. For a while, I let myself believe that was the paper, that the $60,000 was the whole story, the full shape of what had been happening beneath the surface of my marriage, and that from here the rest of the process would simply be mass settlement negotiations, a clean and quantifiable resolution to 11 years of something I'd never been able to properly name. Mara thought so too for a while. She told me in that same meeting that this was more than enough to build a strong settlement position, that we likely wouldn't even need to go to trial, that a case this clearly documented tended to resolve through negotiation once the other side's attorney saw the folder for himself. I drove home that evening feeling something close to relief for the first time in weeks, not happiness. Just the particular relief of finally having proof of something you've felt for years but could never quite say out loud without sounding paranoid, without watching your husband's family exchange a look that suggested you were the unstable one, the difficult one, the one who couldn't just relax and enjoy the family she'd married into. I told my daughter that night, in the careful, age-appropriate way you tell a 7-year-old that grown-up things are being sorted out, that everything was going to be all right. I believed it when I said it. I want that on the record, because everything that came after makes it easy to forget that for a few weeks, I genuinely thought the worst of it was already behind me. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them I hadn't experienced in years, something close to ordinary, which after 11 years of managing someone else's family's expectations felt almost indulgent. I settled into a routine with the kids. Mornings were mine again in a way they hadn't fully been in a long time. No calls to field before breakfast about weekend plans that always seemed to require some accommodation on my part. No text from his mother wondering, in that same warm and reasonable voice, whether we'd be attending this or that gathering. My daughter's teacher mentioned, at a conference that fall, that she'd noticed her participating more in class, raising her hand where before she'd mostly watched. And I remember sitting in that small chair meant for someone half my size, feeling something unclench in my chest that I hadn't realized had been clenched for years. My son had started sleeping through the night again, something he'd stopped doing sometime around the divorce filing, and I found myself some evenings simply sitting in the quiet of a house that finally felt like it belonged entirely to the people living in it. The settlement negotiations moved the way Mara had predicted, slow but steady. His attorney clearly working to minimize the damage of the account records rather than dispute them outright. There was a proposed repayment schedule on the table for the $60,000, structured in installments over several years, an arrangement Mara said was reasonable given what we were actually likely to recover through a longer court battle. I signed off on the framework in principle, relieved to have a number and a timeline instead of an open wound. I saw my husband exactly twice during that stretch, both times at custody exchanges, both times brief and civil in the careful way two people manage when neither wants to give the other the satisfaction of a scene in front of the children. He looked tired. I found I didn't feel much of anything looking at him, which surprised me more than any anger would have. 11 years, and by that point he had become someone I was simply, administratively, in the process of separating from. His mother, meanwhile, sent one more message during those weeks, longer and warmer than the others, expressing hope that the family could find its way back to something resembling normal for the children's sake, and mentioning, almost as an aside near the end, that she hoped the financial matter could be resolved quickly and privately without dragging things out any further than necessary. I read that line more than once. At the time, I took it for what it appeared to be, a mother wanting an ugly situation over with, the same sentiment any of the family members might have expressed. It was only much later that I understood the particular urgency underneath it, the specific reason she might have wanted the whole financial question closed and settled before anyone looked any harder at anything connected to it. I didn't look harder. I had no reason to. Mara had the $60,000 documented cleanly. The repayment framework was moving forward, and every part of my life outside that one open financial question had started to feel, after so many years of not quite trusting it, like it was actually mine. I started painting again that fall for the first time, something I hadn't done since before the kids were born, setting up an easel in the corner of what used to be a room reserved for guests his family never actually visited. My daughter would sometimes sit with me while I worked, asking questions about color and mixing, and I found I liked having someone in the room who wasn't waiting for me to finish so we could get to somewhere else, someone else's schedule, someone else's version of what the afternoon was supposed to look like. I remember a particular Sunday that fall with unusual clarity, not because anything remarkable happened, but because of how remarkably unremarkable it was. My mother came over for dinner. My daughter set the table without being asked, a way she'd started doing since we'd moved into our own rhythm, humming something to herself. My son insisted on serving the roles himself, taking the responsibility with a 5-year-old's total seriousness, going around the table one person at a time. Nobody corrected the order. Nobody checked to see whether he'd gotten it right by some standard only they understood. He simply went around the table giving everyone a role, and when he got to himself last, he didn't seem to notice or mind, because there was no hierarchy at that table for him to have absorbed in the first place, no unwritten rule about who mattered enough to go first. I remember watching him do that and feeling something I hadn't let myself feel since the dinner where all of this began. Not relief exactly, but close enough to it that I didn't question where it had come from. I had no idea, that Sunday, how close I was to the second half of the story. I had let myself believe reasonably, given everything Mara had shown me, that the $60,000 accounted for everything my husband's family had taken from me. I didn't yet know that somewhere in a folder Mara hadn't opened yet, in a filing cabinet at the county recorder's office, there was a document with my name at the bottom of it that I had never once seen in my life. Mara called on a Thursday afternoon, and I knew before I answered that something had shifted, because she never called outside our scheduled check-ins unless something had changed. "I need you to come in," she said. "Today, if you can manage it, not tomorrow." There was a weight in her voice I hadn't heard before, not the brisk competence I'd grown used to, something closer to caution, like she was choosing each word before she let it out. I told her I could be there within the hour, and spent the drive over running through every possible reason an attorney might need to see you urgently. A problem with the repayment schedule, maybe, or something his attorney had raised in the settlement negotiations that needed my input before it could move forward. I ran through half a dozen scenarios on that drive, and none of them turned out to be the actual reason. Her office smelled the same as it always did, bread rising somewhere below us, and her assistant waved me straight back without the usual small talk, which should have told me something on its own. Mara was standing when I came in, not sitting behind her desk the way she normally was, and she gestured me toward the chair across from her with a kind of careful gentleness I hadn't seen from her before, not once, in months of meetings about account records and custody schedules and every other administrative wound this divorce had opened. "I want you to sit down before I show you this," she said, which was not something she'd ever said to me before, and I felt my stomach tighten as I lowered myself into the chair. "Before I do," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Has your mother-in-law ever had access to your personal documents, mortgage paperwork, anything with your signature on it, anything she might have had time alone with?" The question landed strangely, because I hadn't thought about that particular afternoon in years, and yet it surfaced immediately, whole and specific, the way certain memories do when you're finally asked the right question about them. I told her about the week his mother had stayed with us after her surgery, 2 years before the anniversary dinner, and how I'd walked into my own home office to find her going through a folder of mine, mortgage paperwork spread across the desk like she'd been at it for a while. I hadn't left the documents out. They lived in a drawer she had no reason to be near. She told me she was searching for a pen, I said, hearing how thin the explanation sounded now, out loud, in a way it never had at the time. She said she'd found the folder by accident and that paperwork soothed her, something about her generation liking to keep things organized. I remember feeling strange about it for maybe an hour, and then letting it go because she'd just had surgery and seemed bored, and it felt unkind to make something out of nothing. How long was she alone with those documents, as far far as you know. I thought back, trying to reconstruct an ordinary Tuesday from 2 years earlier with the kind of precision I'd never had reason to apply to it before. I don't know exactly. I was gone most of the afternoon. 3 hours, maybe 4. Mara made a note, her expression giving away nothing, and I understood, watching her write, that whatever she was about to show me was going to make that afternoon mean something entirely different than it had meant to me for the past 2 years. She had a single document on her desk, not a folder this time, just one page, and she waited until I was fully seated, until she'd made sure I was actually looking at her, before she slid it across. "I want you to look at this before I say anything," she said. "Tell me what you see." It was a quitclaim filing, dated 18 months earlier, formatted the way I vaguely recognized property documents being formatted, though I'd never actually filed one myself in my life. The language was dense in the particular way legal documents are dense, full of clauses I had to read twice to fully parse, but the substance of it was plain enough once I found the relevant section, sitting there in careful, formal language, describing an attempt to transfer 10% ownership of our house into the name of my husband's mother. I read it twice before the second part registered. 18 months earlier put the filing date barely 6 months after that afternoon at the dining table, close enough that the timing sat in my chest like something physical. My signature was at the bottom. I stared at it for what felt like a long time, though Mara later told me it was maybe 15 seconds, that kind of specific silence where the room seems to hold its breath along with you. I had never signed anything like that in my life. I said so out loud, my voice coming out smaller than I meant it to. "I had never signed it," I said again, as though repeating it might make the document itself reconsider. "I don't understand how my name is on this. I've never seen this page before in my life." Mara nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've already suspected the answer to a question before they ask it. "That's what I thought," she said. "I already had it examined." She explained it to me the way she explained everything, methodically, without theatrics, laying each piece down like she was building a case in real time in front of me rather than simply reporting one. A forensic document examiner she worked with regularly had compared the signature on the filing against 4 years of mortgage paperwork I'd genuinely signed, documents where my handwriting appeared dozens of times, enough to build a reliable baseline. The comparison hadn't been subtle. Mismatched pressure throughout the signature, heavier in places where my natural hand moved lighter in places where it should have pressed down, awkward pen lifts halfway through my own last name, the kind of interruption that happens when someone is copying a shape they don't actually know how to write fluently, rather than producing it from memory the way you produce your own signature 1,000 times without thinking. Traced curves in the loops of certain letters, evidence, the examiner had noted, of someone working slowly from a reference rather than signing naturally. "It's not even a careful forgery," Mara said. "Whoever did this assumed no one would ever look closely enough to check. Most of the time, they'd have been right." I asked her how she'd found it in the first place, since I hadn't been looking for anything, hadn't had any reason to suspect a document like this existed at all. She told me it had come up during a routine title search she'd run as part of preparing the settlement paperwork, a step she said she took in every case involving a jointly owned property, mostly to confirm there were no surprises waiting in the county records. This time, there had been. "The filing never actually went through," she added. "The county recorder's office flagged it on their own, before either of us ever knew it existed, and suspended it pending verification that never arrived. As far as the property records are concerned, your name is still the only one attached to that house. It failed months before either of us found out anyone had tried it at all." I sat with that for a long moment, the relief of it, the actual house still fully mine, tangled up with something much darker underneath, the knowledge that someone in my husband's family had sat down at some point, deliberately, with a copy of my handwriting in front of them, and tried to give away a piece of my own home to a woman who had never contributed a single dollar toward it. My husband admitted to the money when Mara's office confronted his attorney with the forensic report. He denied any knowledge of the deed, insisted, through his lawyer, that whatever had happened with that filing was entirely his mother's doing. I no longer had the energy to care which betrayal he wanted credit for, and which one he wanted to leave entirely on her doorstep. His sister's business finally folded within the year, once the repayment schedule started drawing directly from her business accounts she could no longer quietly refill. Nobody stepped in to bail it out this time. His mother never called again after the forgery came to light, not once, no careful, reasonable message about family or misunderstandings, and I found I didn't miss the sound of her voice trying to talk me out of my own eyes. The county's investigation into the forged filing is still open. Mara says these things move slowly, that a clean forgery case still takes time to work through the system, and that the part that matters most has already happened regardless of how long the rest of it takes. The house is still mine. It was always still mine, flagged and suspended by a recorder's office that caught what my own family never bothered to check for. The divorce finalized on an ordinary Tuesday in early spring, gray and unremarkable, the kind of day nobody would circle on a calendar. I walked out of the courthouse holding my daughter's hand on one side and my son's on the other, the same way I'd walked out of that dining room over a year earlier, except this time I wasn't running from anything. I was just going home. Last month, I hosted dinner at my own table for the first time since all of it started. Mismatched chairs, my mother in the good seat by the window, my son insisting again on serving the rolls himself, going around the table without a single unwritten rule to guide him. Without thinking about it, I served myself first. Nobody said a word. Nobody had to.